FromSoftware are a company most people are probably familiar with thanks to Demon's Souls, a PS3 exclusive game from back in 2009. A fantasy action-adventure game with some RPG elements, Demon's Souls represented something of a rebellion against established gaming norms. It's a game with a brutally high level of difficulty, a harsh punishment for being foolish enough to die, a stamina bar that severely limits movement, and an obtuse story brimming with macabre lore. The game was a success, and it formed the basis for FromSoft's even greater achievements, the subsequent Dark Souls trilogy and Bloodborne. In 2019, a successor to the Soulsborne series released, Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice, a game about a shinobi fighting his way through feudal Japan. Sekiro retained the legendary difficulty and many of the hallmarks of the previous Souls games, but it also represented a dramatic departure from many of the Soulsborne series norms. It introduced a lot of changes, and many of those changes brought Sekiro more in line with other AAA adventure games. Rather than creating an open-ended gaming experience that accommodates many playstyles like Dark Souls, Sekiro is a tighter and more specific experience that aims to tell the story of a wandering shinobi, Wolf, on a quest to rescue his young master from the clutches of a local warlord, utilising all of his shinobi tools along the way. Sekiro was a game that I honestly disliked when I first started playing it, feeling like it strayed too far away from FromSoft's usual style. What's more, the crushing level of difficulty left me on the verge of quitting on more than one occasion, even as a Soulsborne veteran. As the game progressed though, my attitude began to change dramatically, and after I'd bested the game's final boss, I reflected on my experience and realised Sekiro had grown on me, in a way no other game had. What once I considered a disaster actually ended up being one of the most exhilarating gaming experiences I've had in years. On second playthrough, I loved every second of the game, and its genius was something I had a new appreciation for. While I originally disliked a lot of the changes the game introduced, on reflection I feel like nothing Sekiro introduced is a mistake, and in fact, every alteration Sekiro made to that FromSoft style was actually for the better. This video is a love letter to Sekiro, and an attempt to argue that virtually every deviation of Sekiro's from FromSoft's usual formula is a rousing success. I want to try to illustrate how the vast majority of Sekiro's changes complement the characteristics that Sekiro does retain from the Soulsborne series, rather than clashing with them. Now, in the interest of fairness, one or two grievances are aired because, after all, no game is perfect. And a quick note at this stage, spoilers for many FromSoft games ahead. Consider yourself warned. Before we get going, please do check the description. I've got a list of songs that I've used in this video, and a special thanks section for some of the footage I've used and spliced into this video. In terms of differences, three major talking points spring to mind immediately when contrasting Sekiro with the Soulsborne series. Three deeply influential changes and additions that completely alter the DNA of how Sekiro is played. Those three talking points are Sekiro's approach to combat, its addition of stealth mechanics, and its greater freedom of movement. Combat seems as good a point as any to start with. As with other Soulsborne games, even the simplest enemy can be a real challenge in Sekiro, and taking on mobs of enemies at once is still a foolish idea. That's because Sekiro retains the reputation all FromSoft games have for unrelenting difficulty, a difficulty that derives from a system of combat that severely punishes players for making the wrong moves or being impatient. One or two good hits from an enemy is usually all it takes to reduce your health down to the bare minimum, and in Sekiro a lot of enemies are incredibly defensively minded. This combination of hard-hitting enemies who are extremely defensive ensures that a brute force approach isn't going to work. Even playing it safe and waiting for an opportune moment to strike isn't a viable option in this game, as some battle-hardened enemies simply do not let down their defenses. How does the game encourage you to approach combat then? Well, by parrying. Parrying has always been optional in previous Soulsborne games. Those who chose not to master it could still defeat any and every opponent by employing a different tactic. Sekiro, on the other hand, pretty much demands that the player invests time in learning the timing of parrying and countering, and this change is at the heart of Sekiro's fast-paced and visceral combat system. Parrying involves hitting the block button at the point of the impact of an enemy's attack. One successful parry can open up weak enemies to a death blow, a quick-time event-style moment in which the enemy's defenses are temporarily broken, opening them up for an instant killing blow. For larger enemies or bosses, chaining multiple parries together is a necessary skill, because some opponents set a truly rapid pace. Reflexes are definitely tested here like never before. Additionally, some specific attacks demand to be countered rather than parried. Countering involves hitting the dodge or jump button at just the right time to nullify a stronger enemy's attack, and similarly leave them open to a punishing counter-attack. For most bosses and enemies, there is no obvious cheese and there is no viable slow approach. Hitting a parry or counter is the only solution. It results in Sekiro feeling like a painful learning process, and makes certain portions of the game feel even more inconquerable than any FromSoft experience before. But the reward for mastering the parrying mechanics and giving a boss a beatdown, it's that warm sense of self-satisfaction. It's worth mentioning Sekiro has a little dedicated training area where you can safely practice parries. This is somewhat against the traditional FromSoft ethos of avoiding hand-holding players, but frankly, Sekiro's combat mechanics are so precise that this area is a really welcome addition. Any comparisons you find online highlighting the similarities Sekiro has with rhythm games are completely apt. A lot of Sekiro's combat relies on hitting the right buttons at the right times and learning the ebb and flow of different enemies' attack patterns. It's not going to be everyone's cup of tea, but in terms of simulating the intensity of real-world combat, Sekiro is unmatched. Or at least I feel like it, because I've not been in a katana fight before. A common criticism that has been levelled at this style of gameplay is that it's entirely possible to spam the parry button to win. This does have the potential to work against some bosses like Gyobu Oniwa, but it won't work against every enemy type. It's a tactic that can't be employed against the Chained Ogre, for example. So it's not a totally valid criticism, and it's an unfair way of boiling Sekiro's complexity down to simple button mashing, when most enemies take a little bit more than that to dispatch. Now, to add one further dimension to combat, Sekiro does away with stamina in favour of posture. In combat, both you and your opponent have a posture meter. Your meter depletes when you're struck, or even when defending against heavy attacks. And if your posture is completely broken, it leaves you wide open for a fatal blow. Enemies of all shapes and sizes also have a posture bar of their own. Successfully striking an enemy reduces their posture, and successfully pulling off a parry or counter reduces it quite significantly. When an enemy's posture meter depletes completely, it leaves them open to be executed or to lose one of their vitality nodes. And can I just take a moment to mention that executions are incredibly satisfying. The combined visual audio effect of the camera slowing down, zooming in, and the red deathblow dot appearing over an enemy telling you to finish them off is like a mini shot of adrenaline. It's an awesome little effect. Anyway, back on topic, the addition of this posture meter completely redefines how bosses and enemies can be tackled, because it opens up a second means of defeating an enemy. You can play it slow, pick your moments and focus on whittling the opponent's health down to 0. Or you can play super aggressively, rely on your countering and parrying, and defeat opponents much quicker by drastically reducing their posture bar down to 0 and killing them off while they still have a semi-filled life bar. A final complexity is that, unlike their health, an opponent's posture can regenerate. Capitalizing on an enemy's poor posture means retaining an aggressive approach. The risk here, of course, is that being too aggressive can leave you open. So the perfect combination of swipes and parries is what usually gets the job done. There is a defensive option baked into the game too. The game lets you defend light strikes with your katana, but too much blocking can result in Wolf's posture being completely broken, leaving the player open for a free attack. Posture can be regained by removing yourself from combat and having a breather, though sometimes it's hard to find time and space, particularly in intense boss battles. The entire posture system is, in a word, genius. Aiming to reduce an opponent's posture is the ultimate risk-reward strategy. You put yourself in harm's way intentionally, but if you're successful, you'll dramatically reduce your time in battle. It's also worth mentioning that stamina, as a concept, isn't missed here at all. Unlike stamina, posture balances the player and the AI perfectly. Both you and your opponents have a posture meter, so you're on even footing. In Soulsborne games, you, the player, are hampered by a stamina meter, but the majority of bosses attack absolutely tirelessly. In summation, I emerged from Sekiro quite confident in the opinion that it has the tightest and the most enjoyable combat in perhaps any game ever. Combat has always been at the heart of FromSoft games, and I believe the significant tweaks that Sekiro makes to Soulsborne's gritty and difficult combat are unilaterally all great changes. Souls games have been built on the basis of them being difficult, but I'm sure many Souls veterans felt Dark Souls 3 was on the easier side of the difficulty scale, even if that game was great. Sekiro redefines combat in a way that even Souls veterans will find unfamiliar, and presents grizzled players with a new, intimidating system to master. This approach of changing things up and making the player feel totally uncomfortable is the very essence of what made FromSoft games so great in the first place, and it carries on the spirit of Demon Souls and Dark Souls. It creates that unique sensation of both fear and satisfaction that those games epitomized, but which has kind of diminished as the Souls series has gone on and players have become more familiar with what to expect. We're not just going to end things there though. There's a lot more to Sekiro than just combat. What you have to keep in mind with regards to Sekiro is that there's no character customization. Dark Souls lets you play the game in a variety of ways. You can be a mage, a brute, a sneaky thief, etc. There's a few options. In Sekiro, you take control specifically of Wolf, a shinobi who has been raised to follow a martial way of life since childhood. As a shinobi, his expertise with the katana are important, but a shinobi has more tools in their box than just head-on combat. And Sekiro challenges you, the player, to master and mix up all of those other auxiliary skills on your quest. Outside of combat, Sekiro's two main shinobi-flavoured innovative changes are the introduction of a grappling hook and the introduction of stealth mechanics, both of which are rooted in the historical reality of life as a Sengoku-era shinobi. These two changes allow Wolf to traverse environments with Batman-like quickness, and allow Wolf to dispatch enemies silently, using a stealthy approach. I personally tend to shy away from playing stealth-based games and usually sigh at the prospect of navigating stealth-based mechanics. There are a few fun exceptions that spring to mind though, like the Batman Arkham series. I feel Sekiro falls into the same category. Utilizing stealth means skulking around undetected and picking off enemies one by one before popping back into the shadows and moving on to the next target. Enemies can, of course, detect you if you don't move around and hide strategically enough, and some enemy sentries, when they spot you, might even alert every other goon in the entire area to your presence, which can put you in a really difficult position. It's always possible to retreat and stay in cover long enough so that the enemies get bored and forget about you. It's not amazingly sophisticated, but stealth represents an efficient alternative to hacking and slashing at enemies. It helps players mitigate the idea of taking on mobs of enemies all at once, and represents a fun new skill to try to master as you get used to different enemies' movement patterns. If you have any sort of issue with using stealth, you're perfectly free to go down the combat-centric route instead. And if you're struggling, there's a few abilities and item buffs that can make the stealth experience a little easier. As enjoyable as it is to parry or backstab an enemy in the Soulsborne series, Sekiro makes a successfully executed stealth kill feel insanely satisfying, with little camera zooms, audio cues, and bespoke death animations. Taking out a whole cohort of enemies efficiently, without a scratch, is immensely satisfying, and obviously not possible in the more combat-centric Soulsborne games. Introducing stealth sections into a difficult, trial-and-error based game actually kind of works. Stealth sections are often a slog in easier games, because making a mistake often results in a quick death and a forced restart, even on games on the easier side of the spectrum. In such games, being forced to be stealthy is an absolute drag and disrupts the flow of the game. You're probably going to be dying a lot in Sekiro anyway, so a few extra deaths at the expense of working out an optimum stealthy route through a well-guarded area don't really disrupt the flow of the game at all. Now, early in the game, our valiant hero Wolf is maimed, losing one of his arms in a duel. In its place, a prosthetic limb is attached thanks to a similarly one-armed sculptor. One of the many uses of this prosthetic is that it grants Wolf the ability to utilize a grappling hook. The addition of the grappling hook results in the level design philosophy of Sekiro departing from that of older Soulsborne games dramatically and for the better. Sekiro's areas are noticeably more vertically minded than ever before because it's easy to both descend and ascend safely and swiftly. It means that a lot of pesky staples of Soulsborne games like endless elevator journeys have finally been ditched for a far more dynamic and enjoyable mode of getting around. It's probably why areas like the Sunken Valley and Senpo Temple are my favourites, because they're areas that are so wide open there is no real way they would have worked in the older games. Senpo Temple is probably the best designed area in the entire game. It's incredibly open, and there are 3 ways to traverse it. You can grapple around and take the high road to skip a lot of encounters. You can play it sneakily and rely on stealth, or you can play it like a regular Soulsborne area and just take on each enemy with your katana one by one. Each specific strategy carries with it its own pros and cons, and that is the part of the brilliance of Sekiro's level design. You can choose the approach that best suits your playstyle, or even better, mix all 3 together. It's also worth mentioning that later on in the game, Wolf gains the ability to dive underwater, which adds a further dimension to the world. Revisiting earlier sections of the game with this new ability brings them to life anew. Arguably the most important aspects of FromSoft's games are the memorable boss fights. From Artorias of the Abyss to the Orphan of Kos, FromSoft bosses are hard as nails but a lot of fun. I feel like Sekiro tried its best to trim the fat and present a lean bunch of challenging, intense, and incredibly fun boss fights. I don't think any one boss fight is quite as memorable as, say, the Ornstein and Smo encounter, but as an overall package, the array of bosses doesn't really have a weak link, leaving the game feeling like a nice, streamlined experience dotted by appropriately challenging bosses. Sekiro has less gigantic, monstrous bosses than other Soulsborne games, with most of the bosses and indeed the regular enemies being fellow human combatants. There are only 1 or 2 shocking bosses, most notably the Guardian Ape, that feel like Soulsborne throwbacks, but the most memorable bosses here feel like gritty duels to the death against relatively evenly matched opponents of human proportions. The enjoyment of all of these sword-wielding encounters lies in the fact that they're interwoven into the plot and narrative of the game in a way very few Soulsborne bosses are. The majority of Sekiro's bosses are fights against characters who have been introduced well beforehand. They're fights against characters we feel we already know, and sometimes know extremely well, which helps to add to the drama of the fight. This is hardly a revelation in video games, in fact it's quite common, but Soulsborne games have thrived on the idea of constantly trying to surprise the player, with only a tiny handful of bosses really set up or teased beforehand. This is especially true of Dark Souls 2 and 3, I feel. In contrast, Sekiro's bosses strive to be as dramatically impactful as possible. I can admit that repetition is a bit of an issue when it comes to Sekiro's bosses. A lot of them are fought more than once, though almost always under slightly different circumstances. The only boss fight that's repeated that I feel really shouldn't have been is the Corrupted Monk. Her illusion is fought in Mibu Village before she herself can be fought in Fountainhead Palace. The illusory monk feels like one of the only really lazy moments in the game, and this ghostly figure feels like an underwhelming end to the Mibu Village section of the game, and lessens the impact of the true Corrupted Monk later on. The folding screen monkeys also deserve a special shout out. It seems FromSoft have finally semi-successfully implemented a puzzle-based boss. Generally speaking, when FromSoft have added a boss whose sole focus isn't combat, it's been either disastrous or dull. Bed of Chaos, I'm looking at you. But the folding screen monkeys represent a much more valiant attempt at introducing a boss that doesn't revolve around combat, and the boss's link to Japanese folklore is a nice little bonus. One substantial change that sets Sekiro apart from the Soulsborne series is its adoption of a roster of mini-bosses dotted through the game to be fought between major boss battles. Said mini-bosses can often be skipped entirely. They're often fought in large, wide open areas and they can be retreated away from. They are effectively like buffed up versions of regular enemies, and fighting them often lacks the cinematic scope that's afforded for the game's main bosses. This actually really helps the main bosses to feel more special and feel like more of a major event. The Dark Souls series had a few real dud bosses, guys like the Covetous Demon, that would, in retrospect, probably be less offensive to some players if they were framed as mini-bosses, rather than given the same gravitas as, for example, Ornstein and Smoke. These mini-boss fights help to pad out the time spent between major boss encounters with some really difficult moments, but they also challenge the player to use a much wide variety of tactics and skills than was ever asked of Soulsborne players in earlier games. Variety, they say, is the spice of life. Mini-bosses come in all shapes and sizes. Some take the form of simple one-on-one duels against tough enemies, others take the form of generals being protected and guarded by half a dozen enemy soldiers. It's this latter category of mini-boss that really shines and requires players to utilise all of the tools in their arsenal in unison. Of course, in these situations, you always have the choice of charging in and taking on every enemy at once, but a better idea often involves trying to find the best way of skulking around the area, picking off the guards stealthily one by one, and sneaking up behind said mini-boss to remove one of their death blows before you even engage them in combat. Occasionally, the mini-boss setups do feel a tad unfair, and a little bit too stacked against the player. Some mini-boss arenas can be quite efficiently cleared of goons by being stealthy enough. Others simply cannot. The worst offender I can think of is the early game mini-boss Juzo the Drunkard, a hard-hitting ex-sumo wrestler who's surrounded by a cohort of annoying enemies who are impossible to take down beforehand without being detected. This just results in one or two of the mini-bosses feeling like gank squads, but fortunately it isn't too prevalent. The addition of mini-bosses is one of the less radical changes of Sekiro that I wish could somehow be backported to the Soulsborne series. I imagine guys like Prowling Magus and the Congregation might have fared much better as mini-bosses. I was originally not too thrilled with the concept of Sekiro. Taking place in a fictionalized, war-torn corner of Sengoku-era Japan, Sekiro is FromSoftware's first game with a Japanese setting in quite a while. At first, I thought the setting was incredibly disappointing, especially because Team Ninja had already thrown their hat into the race to create a Souls-like game set in Japan with Nioh. After experiencing the world of Sekiro, though, I came out of the other end spellbound by the world FromSoft had created. Sekiro's story treads familiar ground. There's a dragon, of course. There's an undead curse plaguing the land. There's a crumbling realm on the verge of collapse. But the real joy of Sekiro is the way that traditional Japanese folklore is interwoven into the fabric of the world and interacts with those familiar Soulsborne story beats. As the main thrust of this video is discussing the way in which Sekiro's differences from its predecessors represent positive steps for FromSoft, I won't dive too deeply into the story, lore and plot points of Sekiro. There's a lot to cover, and that would all warrant a video in itself. The main differential Sekiro exhibits in the plot and setting department is its real-world anchoring. Ashina is a fictionalized area of historical Japan, but piecing together the geography, history and lore of this particular world still has the potential to be just as entertaining and enlightening as it was with FromSoft's more fantastical settings. The real-world setting allows for two unique things to be explored in Sekiro. One is how the fantastical elements of the plot would interact with real-world belief systems. In Bloodborne, after the discovery of Lovecraftian monsters, a church is set up in the city of Yharnam to utilise their blood's healing properties. That's cool and all, but in Sekiro, the rejuvenating waters of the Divine Dragon reach a remote Buddhist monastery and causes the creation of a bizarre, heretical Buddhist sect. Sekiro borrows from real-world Buddhist oddities, such as the Sokushinbutsu, Buddhist mummies who were scattered in the buildings of Senpo Temple, to add a bit of flavour to the extreme nature of the devotees of Senpo. FromSoft games often explore the concept of cycles and cyclical nature. In many ways, Buddhism's core tenets align with this, particularly the belief in reincarnation, but the essence of enlightenment is to escape this cycle. The monks of Senpo have found another way to escape the never-ending cycle of life and death in the form of immortality, and explore that alternative just as fervently as they once must have followed the teachings of the Buddha. This is FromSoft's interpretation of how a real-world location and real-world belief system might be warped and twisted by the ideas they've previously explored in entirely fictional settings, and it's fascinating. The other aspect of Sekiro's real-world setting that's interesting is potential real-world events taking place concurrently with Sekiro's timeline, helping to add to the drama of the game's narrative, particularly if you do a little bit of auxiliary research. For example, the main opponents of the Ashina are the Interior Ministry, who stage an invasion of Ashina Castle in the latter part of the game. Who these guys actually are is only vaguely alluded to, but there's a very good chance they're the agents of Tokugawa Ieyasu, founder of the Tokugawa shogunate, who ruled Japan for 2.5 centuries starting in 1603. Although this isn't confirmed, it adds a lot of intrigue and character to the war the Ashina are fighting, making them a little bit more sympathetic perhaps, but it's also intriguing to wonder if the shogunate would play a prominent role in a potential sequel. Similarly, there's an armoured warrior in Senpo Temple with a son named Robert, suggesting he's of European extraction. The first Europeans in Japan were Portuguese traders in 1543, suggesting this warrior might be among the very first Europeans to step foot in Ashina. The first, but maybe not the last. Ultimately, Sekiro derives quite a lot of gravitas from its real-world anchoring. Ashina is like a mythical corner of the world on the verge of extinction as powerful unifying forces close in on it, and international travellers hear more about it. It's quite intriguing to think about how the magical properties of the rejuvenating waters might fare in the hands of the Tokugawa shogunate, or in the hands of European explorers. Despite the real-world setting, Sekiro still exhibits enough of that trademark Soulsborne ambiguity in its lore to warrant a lot of headcanon. Unlike the Assassin's Creed series, for example, historical figures and events aren't shoved down one's throat. Before discussing the setting and atmosphere of Ashina in more depth, I'll discuss one more aspect of the story, that being the ending. The best possible ending that can be attained in Sekiro is the Dragon's Homecoming ending, in which the Divine Dragon, the progenitor of all of Ashina's magical woes, will be returned to its place of origin westwards. The mere prospect of a Sekiro sequel taking place in China, the most likely birthplace of a dragon mythologically, is an exciting prospect that leaves the door open for a tantalizing sequel more than the ending to any other Soulsborne game. Okay, now let's discuss how Sekiro creates an unparalleled sense of atmosphere. Because Ashina is partially rooted in reality, it doesn't go all out with fantastical environments, but what it does present us with is a beautiful palette of environs that mix real Japanese scenery with mythological landscapes. Ashina Outskirts, Ashina Castle and Hirata Estate are areas dotted with traditional Japanese living quarters and militaristic castles and forts, decorated by dense forest and sharp snowy mountains. They're nice areas, but it's when the game enters its second half and you're introduced to Senpo Temple of Mount Kongo, or the Sunken Valley with its monolithic Buddha statues, that the visual stylings of the game really begin to pop. Admittedly, the world of Ashina is not as varied as other Soulsborne worlds, particularly when contrasted with Dark Souls 1 and 2, but Ashina is brimming with a sense of life and vibrancy that those games were not. One of my biggest bugbears about Dark Souls 1 and 2 is the fact that enemies are seemingly stood around, deathly still, waiting for the player to arrive. It's kind of immersion shattering. Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne alleviated this sensation by having more enemies patrolling around or doing something, but Sekiro feels the most natural when it comes to the way enemies and NPCs are interacting with the world. Nobody feels out of place, nor does any enemy feel like they're simply waiting around for a fight. Ashina feels like a living, breathing place populated by living, breathing people doing their own thing, whether that's patrolling around, guarding something, meditating, or looting and pillaging. This just aids in creating a sense of immersion, and it's always struck me as one of the biggest faults of earlier games. This also helps Sekiro to convey the idea that you're an active participant in proceedings. As the narrative drives on, very visible changes take place in the world around you. Most noticeably, the Ashina province is invaded by the Interior Ministry, and the Ashina Castle and outskirts sections of the game are set alight and swarming with groups of enemies fighting each other. Soulsborne games have previously tinkered with the idea of environments changing under certain circumstances, but this idea feels like it finally comes to fruition here. One aspect of Sekiro which I find to be almost criminally underrated is its soundtrack. Soulsborne games have traditionally been quite quiet, foregoing atmospheric music in favour of ambient noises or enemy moans. The world of Sekiro, in contrast, is constantly brought to life by a fantastic original soundtrack by Yuka Kitamura and Noriyuki Asakura. Making use of traditional Japanese instrumentation, the soundtrack effortlessly flits between beautiful, serene compositions to panic-inducing boss battle music, punctuated with war drums and battle cries. It feels like, honestly, Sekiro needed a robust soundtrack where other Soulsborne games might not have, because its environments are a little more samey, and those environments' denizens are a little less monstrous. Any potential sense of monotony in the game's setting is definitely broken up by the atmospheric soundtrack. We've talked pretty extensively about what Sekiro added or altered, but what did it take away? And more importantly for this video, do any of the things that are removed feel sorely missed? Well, Sekiro does away with any RPG elements of the Soulsborne series. There's no character customization. Until recently, there were no alternate costumes. There's only one weapon that's used throughout the entire game. There's no attribute points. There's also no online features and no phantoms to lend a hand in boss battles. Do I believe any of these elements feel missed? Well, let's discuss. The choice to limit Wolf to one solitary weapon is reminiscent of the Legend of Zelda series. Link uses the same sword throughout the game, but his inventory swells with other useful offensive items that come in handy against specific enemies. Sekiro similarly counterbalances its lack of weaponry by allowing Wolf to learn a copious amount of different moves and abilities to utilize in combat, and by allowing Wolf to utilize various different prosthetic tools fitted into his arm. The tools range from a flame vent that unleashes a cloud of fire to a giant metal fan that provides excellent defense. Mixing up these moves and tools in combat ensures Sekiro's combat feels deep and much more diverse than the Soulsborne games, despite their greater array of arms. The big problem with the tools, in my opinion, is that their usefulness is a little bit unbalanced. The umbrella and the shinobi firecrackers are, for example, indispensable, and by far the best. The firecrackers have the ability to stun just about every single enemy in the game, while the umbrella is amazing and can block just about every attack. On the other hand, the shurikens and the whistle, I found myself virtually never using. I suppose the same can be said of the rest of the Soulsborne games. It's a common experience to wander around, pick up a new weapon, and decide simply to never use it because it doesn't suit your build. But of course, should you play the game again, you might alter your character to suit a different class of weaponry, creating a new experience, something that doesn't really apply to Sekiro. I think an attempt was made by the devs to ensure that not all abilities and tools can realistically be unlocked on one playthrough, so even on your second attempt through the game, you'll still be unlocking new things to utilize, going back and taking on the game's first enemies, after you've already completed the game is an amazing experience and shows you just how far you've come in terms of skill. So in short, the lack of weaponry will probably only affect those players who enjoy replaying Souls games multiple times. Any one-time players probably won't feel like anything's missing, so it's not too much of a crutch. I genuinely don't mourn for any of the other missing parts of the Soulsborne formula I mentioned, however, but that's just purely my personal opinion. I've never been into the multiplayer aspect of the Souls games, so I don't miss that. The lack of friendly phantoms to help in boss fights just helps to force the player to well and truly get good. And the lack of character customization is rebuffed by a character with more lines of dialogue and direct involvement in goings-on than we've ever seen before. Sure, Wolf is a tad stoic, but he serves his purpose as a steadfast warrior dedicated to his mission. FromSoft did pepper the game with micro moments that helped to add a little more character to the sometimes emotionless Wolf. Take his duels against Genichiro, for example. At the end of the game's opening segment, as Wolf reaches to unsheath his katana, his hand is unconfidently shaking. When they meet again at the end of the game, Wolf's hand is as steady as they come. It's a little moment that represents more subtle character development than the silent Soulsborne protagonists ever enjoy. To finish off, I want to mention that there were one or two ideas unique to Sekiro that on reflection had a lot of potential but ended up feeling half-baked. The major one that comes to mind is the way the dragon rot epidemic manifests itself in the world. If you happen to die too many times in the game, the people of Ashina will, one by one, find themselves infected with a disease known as dragon rot, while Wolf remains healthy and unaffected. Interestingly, dragon rot works in the exact reverse of hollowing in Dark Souls, in that it affects everyone else rather than you. There is something anxiety-inducing about dragon rot, and I found it created a terrible sense of guilt in me as I inadvertently caused the denizens of Ashina to fall ill. Fortunately, it can be cured pretty easily by using a specific item at a sculptor's idol, but the problem with dragon rot is that it has no real narrative consequences. Whether you finish the game with literally every Tom, Dick and Harry in Ashina riddled with dragon rot, or finish the game with everyone in tip-top shape, it doesn't affect the outcome at all. For all intents and purposes, it can be quite comfortably ignored, which is a shame and a bit of a waste of potential to have your actions impact the story a little bit more. Dying and dragon rot are also linked to unseen aid, the second new idea I want to very briefly moan about. Receiving unseen aid means that when you die the next time, you won't lose any money or experience points. Receiving unseen aid is completely chance-based. The more dragon rot spreads through Ashina, the lower the chance to receive unseen aid. At its absolute maximum, the player has a 30% chance of receiving unseen aid on any one run. It's a nice bonus for sure, but it's a mechanic that feels badly thought out. In rare instances, it might help a player who may be foolishly rushed into battle, but Sekiro is a punishing game where you should be spending your coin and XP points at the very first available opportunity. My actions have never been altered based on whether I have unseen aid or not, so in reality, it's pretty useless and doesn't realistically affect gameplay at all. It should have either been dropped or completely retooled because, along with dragon rot, it seems to have confused a number of first-time players. And that, folks, is just about everything. Thanks for sticking with it till the end if you're still here. I want to conclude by looping back to the video's introduction and stating that I love all FromSoft's games post Demon Souls, but I wanted to share my love for Sekiro. Sekiro was received well by critics and fans alike, but didn't quite receive the same universal acclaim as either Dark Souls or Bloodborne. With that in mind, you could consider Sekiro an underappreciated masterpiece that I think is aging really gracefully as people reflect on the game. Thanks again for staying with me till the end. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing for more gaming stuff in the future. Also, I'd appreciate hearing everyone's opinion on Sekiro, so please go ahead and share in the comments, even if you're not a fan. I look forward to hearing what everyone's got to say. See you next time.